I know there's all these questions about, well, is it caused by a lack of oxygen to the brain? Is it caused by various drugs given during resuscitation? Is it neurochemicals going crazy, causing hallucinations, in the clinically dead brain? Prior to our research, near-death experiences were just collections of stories. Raymond Moody, who obviously is the mentor, I think, of most of us in the near-death field, but these were people that came up to him after lectures and would tell him about their experiences. So that's, of course, very important, and that's an important first step. But we had a completely different strategy. What we did at Seattle Children's Hospital was we interviewed every survivor of cardiac arrest over 15 years. So our research design was, we first identified survivors of cardiac arrest. Then, after getting permission from the Human Subject Review Board and such as that, we called up their parents and we said, we'd like to interview your child about what it was like to be in an intensive care unit. That's how we explained our study. We didn't even say, something as leading as, oh, we'd like to know, what does she remember about nearly dying? We just said, we'd like to hear, what does she remember about being in the intensive care unit? And we were shocked at what we heard. Probably only 1 out of 200 or 300 children completely survive a cardiac arrest. It's not like you see on TV. By and large, if your heart stops beating and you have to be resuscitated, you're probably going to die or not recover. So we looked at, 300-400 different charts, and we found 26 children who survived cardiac arrest or other examples of clinical death. And to our great surprise, we discovered that 22 of them had some kind of awareness or experience that they referred to the period of time that they were dying. We looked at hundreds of control patients who also had a lack of oxygen to their brain, who also had deranged neurochemicals because they were close to death. And there's expectations of the fear death experience, they call it. These children were also in a very scary intensive care unit environment. And yet none of them had a near-death experience. All of them followed the traditional mainstream understanding of consciousness, which is they didn't remember anything about being in the hospital. They didn't remember anything about being ill. The severe trauma wiped out their short-term memory. The same thing happened to the children who were near death, except right in the middle of this long period of not remembering anything, suddenly they'll say things like, yeah, I do remember something. When the nurses were calling for that crash cart thing, and I saw you sticking a needle in me, I suddenly saw my grandmother. And I was so shocked to see her because she had passed. And then she says, this is a little girl who almost died of infectious mononucleosis. And we had to stick a needle in her heart to resuscitate her. And she saw that as part of her experience. And then she says to me, and then I was back. And I said to her, what do you mean by you were back? And she clenches her fist and she goes, that's what I'm trying to figure out. So these aren't even stories that they're telling. I really get the idea from, people that are understandably skeptical of near-death experiences, that these are just some sort of confabulations or stories that people are telling to somehow, get attention or explain, to their own mind what happened when they died. No, the children describe these fragmentary experiences that they themselves don't understand. And by and large, most of these children hadn't even told their parents about the experience. So there can be no doubt that near-death experiences are, in fact, the dying experience. We're going to all have this experience when we die. I told you about our study. That's a gold standard prospective study of survivors of cardiac arrest, published in the American Medical Association's pediatric journals. And it was then followed up by Pim van Lommel, a Dutch cardiologist, and he did a similar study in adults, much larger, involving 8 different hospitals. And he published his findings in The Lancet, which is arguably the world's most prestigious medical journal.
When I started my specialization in cardiology, I was working at one of the first coronary care units in the Netherlands. In 1969, we had a patient who had a cardiac arrest because of an acute myocardial infarction. And we resuscitated him. We did CPR with several times defibrillation and external chest compression, and after about 4 minutes, regained consciousness. And we were very happy as a resuscitation team. I was the doctor in charge. It was the first time we did it. But the patient was extremely disappointed and told us about the tunnel and the light and music and beautiful landscape, etc. It was quite striking for us. So I never forgot it, but I didn't do anything with it until in 1986. I started to interview patients who had survived a cardiac arrest in the past. And within 2 years, between 1986 and 1988, I had 50 patients who survived cardiac arrest, and 12 of them shared their NDE with me. So that's how it started for me, scientific curiosity. It should be impossible that people have conscious experience during cardiac arrest. There have been some theories based on the hallucination, would be lack of oxygen in the brain, should be whatever. People didn't know how to explain the cause and content of an NDE. And that's why we started in 1988 a prospective study in total of 344 consecutive survivors of cardiac arrest in 10 Dutch hospitals, with the aim to find out if it could explain the cause and content of the NDE. So in 4 years, we had 344 patients who survived cardiac arrest. And we found that 18%, 62 patients reported a classical near-death experience. The 82% did not report any memory from a period of cardiac arrest. So we compared the two groups of patients with and without an NDE, if we could find any significant difference between them. And to our surprise, there was no difference at all. So the severity of anoxia, lack of oxygen in the brain, if people have had a cardiac arrest of 2 minutes or 8 minutes, didn't matter at all. If they have been unconscious for 5 minutes or 3 weeks in coma, didn't matter at all. If they have complicated CPR with artificial respiration, didn't matter at all. If they had induced cardiac arrest in electrophysiological studies in the cath lab, didn't matter at all. So the severity of lack of oxygen in the brain, we could exclude with 100%. All patients had been unconscious because of lack of oxygen in the brain, and only 80% reported a near-death experience. And there was also no psychological explanation like fear of death before the arrest. There was no medical explanation. To our surprise, we found there is no scientific explanation why patients experience a near-death experience in cardiac arrest, but we know for sure that they don't have any brain function and still have an enhanced consciousness with a possibility of perception out and above the lifeless body, with being aware of being dead, coming in a dark space room, going through a tunnel to the light, to beautiful landscape, beautiful colors, meeting deceased relatives, meeting a being of light, having a life review. They relive their whole life. Sometimes we live future events as well. And then they come to a border where they know that when they pass this border, we'll never come back again. And then they hear a voice. They say, it's not your time yet. You have still a task for you. And then they are conscious return into the body again, which is awful for them. So that was the first part of our study. The second part that we did a longitudinal study with taped interviews 2 years and 8 years after the cardiac arrest, with all patients still alive who had an NDE, and a matched control group of patients who had survived cardiac arrest with no NDE. Matched control is the same age, the same gender, and the same time interval. We found, and we want to know about the transformation, because we know that when you have a near-death experience, you will change. That is, there's no fear of death anymore. There's a new insight what is important in life. They feel connected with everybody, with nature, with animals, with plants, and that's why you call it also an experience of oneness. And they have an enhanced intuitive sensitivity. What we found that only the patient with an near-death experience had this classical transformation, which means it's kind of objective proof for the subjective experience. We can get statistical analysis for this transformation. You cannot do statistical analysis for a subjective experience. For a lot of people think you cannot prove anything about subjective experience, but we can talk about this later. So our study took 10 years and was published in 2001 in The Lancet, which was a worldwide stir. It was on the front page of all papers in the world.
Near-death experiences are not the result of a lack of oxygen to the brain. They're not caused by medications. They're not inventions of the mind after the fact. They're, in fact, the dying experience. And I think that you can really recognize this because the main sort of materialistic criticism in near-death experiences, they say, well, it's just neurochemicals at the point of death. Well, everything that we experience is neurochemicals, but they're acknowledging that it occurs at the point of death. So, they're just disputing whether people are actually seeing a real God or what have you. But, that's just a philosophical consideration. So we know that when we die, we have this incredible spiritual experience, meeting some sort of light, a light that has a lot of good things in it, as children say, a light that seems to be filled with knowledge. So that then, I think, validates all the other spiritual experiences surrounding death and dying. Premonitions of death, the shared dying experience, after-death communications. Those things we can't really study scientifically, but if the near-death experience is real, then the premonitions of death are real. And people who have these experiences, by and large, agree.
This has been the A.J. Parr Spiritual Journalist Podcast. Please like, share, and subscribe.